Our first speaker is Aaron. He is a classroom teacher, union organizer, blogger, and occasional musician. Mr. Baker is a faculty advisor for Spectrum, the Gender and Sexuality Alliance at Putnam City North High School in Northwest Oklahoma City.
Thank you, Bree. Yeah, again, my name is Aaron Baker. My pronouns are he, him, his. I taught 7 years in middle school before teaching high school, and I tell every colleague that I can that every high school teacher should teach middle school first. Does anybody agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. Like it literally should be a program. So those 7 years was 7th grade geography and 8th grade U.S. history. I just completed my 3rd year in high school at Putnam City North High School. I spent that pre-COVID and beginning of COVID weird year in world history and Oklahoma. And then during COVID got switched over to government. And I have the privilege each and every school day to collaborate with 12th grade students in project-based civics using Generation Citizen as a framework. And so I'm very, very grateful for that work. And that particular work, my relationship with those students and with Generation Citizen very much informs what I'd like to talk about this morning. I'm not much of a storyteller, so I'm trying to push myself this morning into that realm. So I've got 3, I think, fairly brief stories and a few questions along the way to ask your counterparts, your neighbors right there at the table near you. And so we'll do a few breakouts along the way as well. And then hopefully there'll be time for discussion. I probably can't answer questions because, as I said, I'm pushing myself into some new territory. I would also want to preface by saying I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a scholar in this particular area. I'm a classroom teacher. I'm coming at this from someone who's trying to practice some of these ideas, but also trying to dream about new ways to form our education processes. So I would start with this photo because I grew up poor and white in southern Arkansas and northern Louisiana, mostly in the 80s, basically. That first identity was something that I was much more aware of, our poverty. I wasn't instilled with sort of a racial identity. I very much was raised to believe that, other people had race, but mine was sort of a default position. But the poverty really sort of informed how I view the world, how I viewed the world, and how I continue to view the world. And so I spent a lot of time in adulthood thinking about, how does my childhood in not abject poverty, but very much consistent poverty, how does it inform the work that I continue to do today? So this photo, I would say circa 86 or 87. My memory says that it was the day I killed my first deer, and this is not like a gory story about blood, and it's definitely not a story about guns. That's a different conversation, but it is part of my childhood. But when I look at this photo, I realize, no, I'm not, because I'm pretty sure I was 11 or 12 when I had that first experience, and I don't look to be that old in this photo. So I'm thinking 8 or 9 in this photo. So this was before. I was definitely part of the hunting protocol. This photo was taken at what we affectionately called the gravel pit or the deer camp. It was just a cleared out piece of land in a 1,000-acre section of what is paper. It's owned by the paper mill in Arkansas. And we could smell it, if you know what that smells like. So lots of pines, that were routinely cut down for paper about every 20 years or so. So we're sitting around a fire, probably after the morning hunt. There in the center prominently is my grandfather, who passed away when I was 16 years old. That's part of what makes this photo so special. Also to the right in the back is my grandfather's Jayco J series. Not a fifth wheel, it was we called it a pull behind. You actually had to attach it. I think it had, maybe it was, no, it wasn't a fifth wheel. It had a whole other set of wheels, and you can see the two doors, and we spent a lot of time in there. At one point, probably after this photo was taken, I penciled in a picture of a big buck with, big antlers, and I gave it to my grandfather and wrote, Grandpa's big buck or something like that, and he hung it up in the camper. That's my dad there that I am unsuccessfully trying to pass off an RC Cola to in a glass bottle with like the plastic wrap around it that you could like peel off. That was kind of fun. My Uncle Van is kind of off of the frame here. My mom is sitting in the Datsun, I believe. In my imagination, she's probably balancing a checkbook. That's, for better or worse, a lot of my memories of my mother, they're all fond, but she spent a lot of time either cooking or balancing the checkbook, and sometimes unsuccessfully balancing the checkbook based on our economic status. There were lots of other people involved. They weren't necessarily there that day. My dad was notorious for staying out longer than anyone else. A lot of hunters would come in at 9:30. As a young age as 8 or 9, my dad had me out till 10:30. So we're talking about from 6:30 or 7 till 10:30 on a deer stand, just being completely quiet. And that sort of is still part of who I am as well. As kids, we would run the gravel pit. We would carve out paths out in the back there. We didn't really, not to get too gross, but we didn't really have an outhouse, but we had a couple pits, if you know what I mean. We didn't really use, there's no hookups or anything. So, you don't use the bathroom in that camper. There were a few other campers, some people that were tenting. At one point, my dad had purchased a school bus, and we slept in that school bus a couple times with like probably butane or something that we likely, it's a good chance we weren't going to wake up the next morning, but we did. So some sketchy things that were happening, but also a lot of fond memories. There was a wedding here with like two trees like pulled together for an arch. Every Thanksgiving for probably 10, 15 years was literally on the grounds. And I reflect on that and think about all the hard work that a lot of women went through to like cook in another location and then like transport all that food so these men can like have Thanksgiving in the deer woods. So there's a lot of strange things about it. Not all of it is fond memories, but a lot of it is. I tell this story because there was a lot of things happening with this deer club that I wasn't really aware of. We would travel the land that we leased, and there would be signs that said FWB Club. And for the longest time, because we all attended these small churches called Free Will Baptist, I thought FWB meant Free Will Baptist. But in the last 20 years, in the last stages of my Uncle Van's life, he told me no, that FWB stood for Friends of Whitakers and Bakers. And my grandfather was a Whitaker. My mom's maiden name is Whitaker, and we were all Bakers. So it came on to have like a whole new meaning. Like I said, it was 1,000 acres that were leased from the paper company at a pretty hefty price. Especially for a lot of us who shared sort of an economic status. So it was a huge sacrifice to be a part of this club. There were membership fees, there were yearly elections, there was a president, there was a secretary, there were decisions to be made along the way. And so learning about those things that happened in my childhood partly because I should put this caveat in. My dad has been a pastor all of my life and a little bit before. So he's been pastoring dozens of very tiny rural Free Will Baptist churches for about 50 years or so. He did not get on board with like the first wave of like Billy Graham, like evangelical civics in the early 80s. Like he sort of remained detached from that. His pulpit has always been very apolitical, but even at home, I was not taught as a young child to be civically minded at all. In fact, I was taught to be removed from that. It was a binary. It was a secular and a sacred piece. Anyone familiar with that evangelical Christian idea? The idea that it's the other thing, the whole of civics is in a category called worldly, and we need to sort of be detached from that. We need to be above that in a sense. I say all of that to say I didn't have a civics framework, but I'm able to go back and sort of deconstruct this hunting club as an institution of democracy, of something I can look at in my childhood and say, these are the pieces that was happening. Like essentially, and it's a bit of a stretch, but I kind of look back and say, this hunting club is like an affinity group. These mostly men are getting together on a common interest, and they're forming this very loose democratic institution to pursue that interest. And so that's very helpful for me. So what I'd like to do, yeah, we're doing good. What I'd like to do with your neighbor, just based on that story from my childhood, if you can, might be difficult, but look back into your own childhood. And I don't have these, I intentionally didn't put the questions on the slide. So you got to listen to the question. Here's the question. Where can you look back into your childhood and see what I'm calling, at this point, we're going to process to calling it deep democracy. At this point, what I want to use is direct democracy. And I think we all know, we don't really, I don't feel the need to unpack like representative versus direct. So when I say direct democracy, I'm talking about small, relatively small, and everyone has a seat at the table. So in this case, everyone in the club were able to make those collective decisions together that needed to be made for the group. So again, where can you look back into your childhood and see direct democracy at work in places where as a child you probably couldn't see it? Okay, so as neighbors, let's say 4 minutes, look for, and there may not be formal institutions. This was not a formal institution. Where can you see direct democracy at work where you couldn't previously see it? Okay, that's probably the hardest question.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I've got 4. I've got 3 more, and I think that's the hardest one. And I didn't necessarily plan it that way. It just kind of worked out. Let's see. So again, to reframe it, probably what I could have done better was to just have you talk about like looking for democracy in unusual places, in small places, perhaps. Let me encourage you. I want to make some space for voices to be heard by the entire group. But let me encourage you real quick. I want to take 2. And for all the questions, we'll just do a quick reminder of like speak up, listen up, if you're familiar with that. And basically, I like to do this because I need to speak up sometimes. If your inclination is on a regular basis in environments like this, if your inclination is to speak, then what you might need to think about is listening. If your inclination is not to speak, if your inclination is rather to listen, then I would encourage you to think about speaking up at this particular point. So it makes spaces for the margins. It makes spaces simply, to be honest, for people who are a little bit quiet and shy in environments like this. And I don't know who those people are. I'm asking you to do that. I'm not going to be like, wait a second, you need to, no, I'm not going to call people out. So I'm asking for 2 people that quick story about their childhood and finding democracy in an unusual place. Yeah.
It's really unusual. I was talking about how when I was a kid, and we did Pokemon card tournaments, but we were young enough that we didn't really like play in tournaments, so we made up our own rules and like vote on them in our little group and then like write them down. It's like our own little like charter or whatever. That's the only thing I could like really easily come to mind was just like that direct, like, all right, hands up, all right, and this is what we're writing. You know, obviously not legible by any means or like accurate like spelling, but that just reminds me of that.
When you think about like the feeling you had at that moment, did you feel like you were doing something really big and important, or did it just feel like?
I mean, if like how I wanted to play the game won, like my like suggestion, I was like, yes. But if it didn't, I was like, oh no, I don't want to do that.
That's good. Thanks. That's good. I bet there's some others who are like, oh yeah, I did that too. I just didn't think about it. So one other person.
I'm from Enid, and in '94, somebody that lived in town that we all knew shot his parents in prison. And we knew enough to know that the press they were trying to find his girlfriend, and we knew that. And we knew that they were probably going to let the press on the grounds of the school. So we.
And you were in high school?
And we were in high school, so we were representatives. So I was representative of the junior class, and so I went around to the junior class and got enough signatures, not really signatures, like they would tell me, we really don't want the press on campus. And so we went to the principal and we said, look, they're going to come, we understand that, but can't you put them off campus where they can't see us, because you can't get all of our parents' permission. And that's how we were able to do it. Looking back on it now, we were clearly trying to protect our mental health, but we, of course, in '94, we didn't use that language. We were just like, they're looking for her. We're all upset. We know the older sister, we know him, we know the family. Like, we don't want to have cameras shoved in our face. And so they were able to do it based on the fact that we didn't want them there, because prior to that, they were going to set up on campus at Enid High to get our reaction. And so they actually went across the street, and because of that, and because of how the campus at Enid High was, they hardly got any kids, because we could drive and they weren't near the parking lot. So that was something that we worked together, and it kind of came together organically. I don't know that now with everything, it would be a little different. I taught in Texas for 10 years, and so some of the kids I keep in contact with were deeply affected by what happened in Uvalde. Like, they lost family members. And so they had contacted me like, this is what I'm having to tell people to get off my grandmother's house. Like, this is, and I thought back to that very heavily, because I was like, well, this is the terms to use. Like, because they were just like, one of them's a reporter for AP, and she's like, I can't scream at other reporters. She's like, how do I do this nicely? And I'm like, just tell them to get out. And basically, I'm like, you just have to see, like, no, we're done. She doesn't want to talk to anybody. Let her grieve. And so it just got me thinking about how we just together spontaneously, within like 30 minutes of everybody kind of finding out what happened, I'd started calling around to the juniors. Somebody had started calling seniors. Somebody had started calling sophomores, so that we could make sure we could get them off campus. And I've even contacted some of them, and they're like, yeah, we really were trying to protect our mental health, but we had no name for that. We just knew it was scary to us, and we just knew we didn't want to deal. That was the only time that happened when I was in high school. I don't know that it might happen again up there, because it was just a weird situation.
I like those two stories, the overt civic engagement, right? But also like just the childhood, like Pokemon decisions. They're both part of this democratic process that we're interested in. I think sometimes we focus too much on like, what was your first civic experience, when we can actually dig deeper into the conversation of democracy and find like, when did you first experience like democracy in action? So this story takes us back to the 1920s in Brazil. Some of you might recognize this person, I'm not sure. So as a young man in Brazil, in middle-class Brazil in the 20s, things were going pretty well at a very young age. Then the depression that happened in this country happened pretty much all over the world, including Brazil. And so, about 9-10 years old, this young man really went through a radical economic shift from being distinctly middle class to not necessarily living again. And I feel like I can relate to this story with my own childhood, not necessarily living in abject poverty, but having to relocate because of the economic depression to an area in Brazil where the majority of people were living in abject poverty. So this is a previously middle-class young person now rubbing shoulders. We have concepts about what poverty looks like in Brazil in particular. So this young man tells stories about this difficult time of his life, about how education was very difficult. And even as a child, he knew that he didn't have necessarily like a learning disability or like particular issues with authority or necessarily with the system. But he talks about times when he literally could not learn because he was hungry. And a lot of his work as an adult and his writing as an educator is informed by that time living during that depression. Talks about going outside and playing soccer like every day with the other children in that area. And honestly says that he learned so much about life and about education from his soccer playmates. And so the depression sort of ends. His dad actually dies during that difficult time, and that adds to the problems. But the story sort of flips, young adulthood, and he's able to attend college, and sort of the fortunes are reversed, and experiences middle class again. And again, I can relate to that. Like I'm more middle class now than I've ever been, and so like this duality of economics is something that we can both relate to. It's distinctly Portuguese. You can catch it like pronounced 100 different ways, I think. What I'm gonna say, because I'm not good rolling my R's, instead of like putting in the hard R, which I feel like is really like the wrong direction, I'm just gonna put in the D, and you probably won't hear it often like this. So it's likely you've heard it pronounced a different way, but I'm pronouncing this person's name as Paulo Freire. So again, the D is like a really, really nice Portuguese rolled R. So Paulo Freire, if you're familiar, the seminal work is Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So writing about education, and particularly in the context of adult literacy, which was the work that he did as an educator in Brazil. It's a thin book. It's not very long. The translation in English will at times make you feel like you're reading a language you don't understand, because even though it's not long, it's very dense and it's very difficult to get through, at least for me. So you might be able to breeze right through it. I don't have time to unpack Freire entirely. I just want to focus on one thing he talked about, and it's kind of the central idea of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And if you're familiar with the book, you're probably familiar with the concept that he talks about, the banking system of education. And so this whole presentation for me, I got to give credit where credit is due. I was in this city like a month ago with Arian and Destiny from Generation Citizen. We were presenting for Norman Public Schools in a very similar format. We were talking about democracy in the classroom. And out of the blue, I mentioned Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed as like a context. And sort of out of that thought is how I really proposed for this session today. So the banking system of education, in a nutshell, is that Freire was saying that the traditional mode of teaching is to take what's in the teacher's brain and transfer it like a deposit at the bank into the brain of the student. And like that's the transaction, and you can't necessarily withdraw the other way, What he says is that the banking system is all about that one way. The teacher has the knowledge, the student does not have the knowledge. The teacher needs to give the knowledge to the student from one brain to the other. Take it out of mine and put it into yours. And we obviously can see that. We can look back in U.S. history and see that reflected. I think we could all agree that there has been a shift away from that traditional mode, especially in K-12. There's not, it doesn't seem to be dominant that you would walk into a K-12 classroom and see someone, lecture for 55 minutes, because the lecture process, right, fits with the banking system of education. So I'm not here to espouse all of Frady. I'm not here to get you to subscribe to his critical pedagogy, which I cannot unpack for you. But he's obviously criticizing the banking system of education. And his alternative is that students can create their own processes of learning and don't inherently lack the knowledge. What they need is a facilitator, essentially. And I was listening to a podcast this week, and honestly, I did not know, because I've been teaching with Generation Citizen for about 5 years, and I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The two were not mixing in my mind at all. I wasn't connecting the dots until I was presenting with Arian about a month ago. I had never thought about Pedagogy of the Oppressed as it relates to civics education. But listening to a podcast this past week, a contemporary of Frady's who actually worked with him used the phrase participatory action research to describe Frady's concept of how students can create their own meaning and create their own learning processes, a research process. And he was doing this with adults learning to read in Brazil. So again, I'm not here to put that to you. I want you to be able to be critical of that. I think he would approve of your critique of his work. But I would ask you this, again, as a group, and so we got to keep going. I'm going to give you 4 minutes with the neighbor there, good or bad, whatever your view is of that banking system of education. I want you to sort of reflect on your own. And again, it's going to inform how you feel about it. It's going to inform whether or not you think, your own work is a positive or a negative, let's say. So the question is, how much of your work in your mind is informed by this banking system of education, for better or worse? I know that a lot of us are classroom teachers, but I put work in here because all of us, I think, are in and around education. So we just want to talk about work. So again, the banking system of education, putting knowledge from the teacher's brain to the student's brain. How much of your work in 2022 do you think is continue to be informed by that system of education? 4 minutes. Okay. I'm going to try to be mindful of time. Hopefully you found some value in that. I kind of overheard a few things. I have one question that I think there's someone out there that can help us with this. I'm social studies, always been social studies, and I don't want to just leave everyone else out. I'm interested in someone that can talk about the banking system of education in another content area. Math, science, language arts, yeah.
Well, we were talking about the concept that I employ. I do, we do, you do. So you demonstrate to the students, you model to the students, then you do it together. And then you have them do it independently and you walk around to see if they've got the concept. I've done it for math, I've done it for reading, social studies, even art projects.
Do you see that as the banking system or as an alternative?
I see it as actually incorporating the banking system.
Okay.
Because in the fact that we're actually modeling, then we do it together, then they do it independently.
Okay.
So it's kind of like, okay, I'm taking my brain, here it is, and then let's do this together. And also with that doing together, a lot of times I encourage peer teaching. So, you know, you have a really quiet student that's really smart, insecure. So you put them with the lower student, and then it's a win-win on both sides. The lower student gets the information, and the higher student develops a self-confidence.
Did you say this is math?
Yes, I do it for all
Okay.
subjects.
See, I my hat's off to you. Like I have a very difficult time relating to math education. I feel like it's like another world. Like we should all be trained in different education departments.
What also is, I have math vocabulary, and I tell them they have to learn math ease.
Does anyone know of a world that has a workaround in math, a workaround of the banking system? Yes, briefly.
Yeah, my daughter had a high school math teacher that just kind of flipped her lip because she had always been taught through that banking system as so many of us had. And she had this guy who came in, he was a first year teacher, had been like a fighter pilot, and put them all in groups and gave them like large poster sized whiteboards and just gave them problems and told them to solve it. And then they shared out how they solved it. And they're just like, they're a little bit upset because she came home. He's like, he's not teaching math. Like, he's doing it wrong, Mom. And I'm like, well, actually, I think he's doing it right because you've complained about this the whole time. You've been doing math that like all you do is like, I teach you one way to do it, and then you do 30 problems the same way, right? But you never like kind of unpack those concepts. And, so they had a group of 4 and they were given problems, and then they got up and talked about how they solved it. She learned more math that 1 year. And I was just like, dude, can you teach the rest of her math? Because, this was, I was like, can you make the rest of the math department do this?
So quick poll from parents in the room. Like, how many of you have heard that? I heard a kid come home and be like, I can't do this homework because the teacher didn't teach us this, how to solve these math problems. And that obviously was like, oh, that's really frustrating. But now I'm like, maybe that.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, because she's a really creative person. She's got a degree in art history and artist and all this kind of stuff. And so like after she got over that initial bit, it was like that collective whole class is like, this isn't the way we've been math students since kindergarten. This isn't how you teach math. Once they kind of got over that, it was really like she's a talker and she's a collaborator. And like I said, I think she learned better math that year, those concepts.
Okay.
Some of those things they just skated over. And like I was super impressed. I'm like, dude, he needs to be telling everybody else how to do this,
And it is clearly harder in the content area like math. And so full disclosure is that I am 100% invested in what Frady's colleague called participatory action research, which doesn't involve, it involves very little that I have that my students need to get from me and from my brain. There's very little content-wise that I am interested in being like the sum of what we do in our class. So I got to be conscious of time. The third story takes us to 1976 in New Hampshire. In the backyard around a picnic table, there's a group of friends who know that the power company is trying to bring in a nuclear power plant. The power company is one of the smallest in the nation, and nuclear power is brand new, and the technology was nothing like it is now. And these people gathered around this picnic table knew that it was a dangerous endeavor, and they didn't want it in the community. The whole story about what became known as the Clamshell Alliance sounds quite similar to what's happening in this city with the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority. People are gathering in backyards and saying, we don't want this to happen. So they used every tactic in the book, everything you can imagine. It was intersectional. They took cues from the civil rights movement. They took cues from all other movements that preceded them to form this affinity group that became known as the Clamshell Alliance. And in 1977, at one point, they held a number of demonstrations on the proposed site of the nuclear power plant. And one of them in April of 77, Like 2,000 people were on site in this act of civil disobedience. Like it was essentially a blockade. They essentially, it was nonviolent direct action. They were putting their bodies in the place to stop this thing from happening at that level. 2,000 people, 1,400 people were held by the National Guard Armory, were arrested. Like that's a massive arrest, and it took on international news, and alliances started to spread all over New England. The organization existed for another 20 plus years into the 90s. And at some point in 1977, I'm not sure if it was before or after that major act of civil disobedience, Murray Bookchin became involved with the Clamshell Alliance. Bookchin was born the same year as Frady. Bookchin is from Vermont. Bookchin early on would get in local arguments with Bernie Sanders over municipal issues in Burlington. They both are cut from the same cloth. Bookchin went the whole gamut from Lenin to all of them, just looked into all of the political ideas. And when he would sort of become disgruntled with something, he would just call people out and move on to another movement. Like he literally pissed off everyone in every political movement you can possibly think of. At one point was calling himself a libertarian. At another point was calling himself an anarchist. And eventually there was something called Libertarian Socialism. Wrap your brain around that. And that's where he sort of came up with something that he was calling communalism and or municipal confederalism. And I don't have the ability to even think about unpacking it, but the guy really liked city governments, essentially, town and city and village types of governments. So if you know anything about anarchism, you know that it's not a free-for-all. It's a different way. It's a decentralized way of thinking about political systems. And Bookchin was very into that. And so he sort of played around with the Clamshell Alliance and thought about other things as well. So Bookchin, again, I think I bring him up because when I'm working with the seniors in high school, the phrase "all politics is local" it's sort of flat. It sort of hits flat for my students. I mean, they kind of get it, and we can kind of unpack it a little bit, but it doesn't have enough teeth, I think. There's something else out there that I haven't come up with yet that Bookchin can sort of inform for us. And the only way I've come to figure it out is it's not all politics is local. If there's like a hierarchy, I would say when it comes to democracy, the smaller the better. That's logical, right? We know that this country's commitment to democracy has been tested. And we know that even before, this country's version of democracy is not direct, it's representative, and we certainly can talk about that. But when I talk about deep democracy in the classroom, I am talking about something direct. I am talking about something that essentially is not a model, is not something that we are trying to replicate, because it is a US government class that I spend my time. So I've got the standards, we've got to walk through, and so we spend a lot of time talking about the federal government, the state government, and to a lesser degree, local governments. But as much as I can, within the parameters of keeping my job, I like to flip the script and put more of that emphasis on municipalities, on local governments, but even more so when it comes to our relationship as a class. And I'm trying to be intentional about my words. Our relationship with Generation Citizen, we are focusing on our class as a democratic institution. a democratic institution. Man, it's 9:50. So this is a picture from Civics Day, and this is what deep democracy looks like. This is one of our school board members that is out of focus here, but if you could see the face here, there's no speaking. And this is the speaking. Number one, I think my best piece of advice, a tiny, tiny place to start, is to never ever say my classroom. So if you're thinking about democracy at all in the classroom, it needs to be our classroom. It needs to be our space, something that we are creating. And it's fleeting. That's the thing about it. We're creating this institution that's going to go away. In my case, in 3 months from now, it's literally going to stop existing. But does it? Because that's the other thing I'm playing around with. What does it look like for the class as a democratic institution to continue when the semester is over? For right now, I'm playing with the idea of Discord, which is an app that the students are kind of into right now. And so we're trying to embed that at the beginning and have it live on after the semester is over, after Google Classroom has been archived. You follow me? Because the LMS is not really going to live on past the semester as well. So in conclusion, when we write a class constitution, we are not creating something that looks like the US Constitution. We are creating something as important, if not more important, to the project of democracy as the US Constitution. If that shocks you, I'm sorry. When we make decisions, when we use consensus building to decide on a focus issue, we are not replicating, we are not mocking consensus as it takes place in Congress or in state houses or senates. Because to be honest, they suck at it, right? We know that. So we can actually do better. Our democracy is deeper when it comes to consensus building. And we do a little bit of representative democracy because we can't send everyone to Civics Day. But even when we do that, it's my opinion that we do it better because it's smaller, it's direct, it's deeper. And so I have, in my mind, and I don't know if anyone else can take this journey with me, but the whole thing has been flipped upside down. And in the description, that's the best way I know to describe it, is that what happens in our classroom is democracy, and then we can peer at the US government, federal and state and local level, and say that this is what we're studying, these standards is our classroom writ large, rather than the opposite where we can do all the things that they can do. No, it's like we're actually excelling in this particular area. We have them beat on this other thing, and it's student voice. And I don't have time, but what so many in this state are elected leaders and appointed leaders are afraid of right now is not really indoctrination. Because if we're talking about democracy in the classroom, and it's my contention that democracy is at an all-time high in our public school classrooms, an all-time high, what they're really pining for is a return to some indoctrination. And what they're really upset about is some of the myths are now gone. You don't have a lot of social studies teachers saying things like, the United States is the greatest country in the history of the world, because it's not something you're supposed to teach, because it's not in our standards. So that's a whole other thing that I wrote about last week about these myths and indoctrination. If you want to check that out, it's spoonvision.wordpress.com. So that's where I put a lot of my wanderings, that, especially in the summer, when I feel like I have a little bit more freedom of speech, right? So Spoon Vision, like a spoon, and then the word vision, and it's at WordPress. So spoonvision.wordpress.com. So Bree, I'm sorry, that's all my time, but if we have some discussion time, I don't know.
Yeah, we can take, if you have anybody who wants to ask any questions or anything like that.
I have one question. When there's a local issue and outside money comes in on one side or the other of a local issue. Do you bring that up? Like, why is outside money coming in on this very local issue or very local race?
I think I would. I
Okay,
like that.
okay.
I like that. Yeah, I would see that as a villain to democracy and civics education. Is like, why are they messing up this good thing that's happening at a municipal and a local level? Yeah.
This is a separate issue, but the city of Norman tried to do a plastic bag ban and the governor shut it down. And I thought, well, wait a minute, what about local rule?
Local control.
You know?
Local control, but when it fits,
When it's convenient.
when it's convenient. Anything I can clear? I don't have a linear way of thinking, so.
Really amazed at what PACs are formed and what they do. It was like, deer in front of headlights when I explained about PACs. And they were like, so you mean somebody can just join a group together and do this? And I went, yeah, they can. And they were just totally amazed about PACs.
Yeah.
It was like I was introducing a whole new world to them.
Yeah. And the two parties are equal offenders. So I think we can go, I think we speak very frankly about PACs. Like,
But when I had them do a web quest, and they were just totally shocked at what they found.
Of how many packs they found.
Uh-huh.
Those clips from Stephen Colbert from years ago when he formed his super PAC and like walks you through it. It's such a great lens because he does it very approachably for all Americans. And you're like, oh, unlimited amounts of money. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, this is not how I thought democracy worked. Yeah.
well, thank you so much, everybody.